Hello everybody, welcome to Crafty Soup. My name is Misty. As part of the design team over at the Counterfeit Kit Challenge group, every month we do a project called Forgery on the 4th, where we are inspired by existing products on the market. And this time around, we are inspired by this particular kit. Links to all that below. And what I particularly was drawn to was all of the doodly elements in this kit. So that's what we're going to do today. We are going to doodle our own embellishments and pattern papers, and I will give you lots of tips and tricks along the way. So let's dive in. So I'm going to be working with basic supplies. I've got a stack of cardstock here and then some pins in different sizes. The 3 pins on the bottom are micron pins in 08, 03, and 02. But you can just use one pin. You don't have to have all of these different pins. I just like to work with some different sizes so that I can get different qualities of lines. Now this pin up here is one of my favorites. It is kind of a calligraphy pin, kind of. I'll link that up below, but what I like about that is that the flexibility of the tip gives you easy ways to get thicker or thin lines, and so you can do a lot of this stuff with just the one pin. Now, if you are new to doodling and this makes you a little nervous, what I'm going to recommend here is to play with your pins first, or single pin, and use it in a way that you can get various thicknesses and thinness of lines. Hold it upright straight, tip it sideways, so on and so forth, so that you can experiment with your pen and see what it can do. And that'll give you more flexibility when you start doodling. Now, I'm just showing you how these pins vary from each other so that if you like what I'm doing, you can possibly invest in some of these pins. And I will leave you links to any products down below in case you're interested in that. Now let's talk about a few techniques of doodling. We're going to use very basic shapes like hearts, rectangles, circles, etc. And we're going to use some shadowing techniques. So I just drew a circle, and the first shadowing technique was just to draw straight lines coming off the bottom of that circle. The second technique is to add a crosshatch to those straight lines, where you add a second line on an angle. And here is a little bit of a tip on creating roundish looking objects. If you have a circle, flower, etc., you can add a shadow to the bottom edge on a curve, and that will make it look more rounded. Now I'm doing a shadow technique just with stippling, which is just making a lot of little dots. Now I'm going to keep my dots more dense towards the object, and I'm going to let them kind of taper away as I get farther away from the object, and the same with the shadow to round the object itself. Now we won't get intense with these techniques, but just so you know what I'm doing when we get there. Okay, the first thing we are going to do, and I pop that up on the screen, is to doodle a frame, kind of a Polaroid style frame. I did start with a 4x6 piece of cardstock to outline it. I didn't trace it directly because that would make the lines too straight and formal. I just kind of drew around the outside to keep my lines more doodly organic. Now I'm going to just hand draw the inner part of the frame, and that again is going to keep it more organic. I am mixing up my pins here for one thicker line and one thinner line. If you have just one pin, use those techniques we talked about earlier where you can angle your pin in different ways to get different thicknesses. I did add some extra doodling on the frame. That's totally optional. You can save that for another time in case you orient your frame differently, which we'll talk about in a minute. Now to cut out the inside of the frame, I like to use a sharp tool to poke and then use my scissors to widen that hole and then create some rays from that center hole so that the paper is more flexible as I move my scissors around the inside of this frame. And that gives us a finished frame. Now I'm going to show you this frame on top of different sizes and orientations of photos. Now see here with my cat, I wish I had waited for those hearts so that I could orient the hearts in a different direction for my photo. But you can use those frames on top of any size or shape of photo. All right, the next thing we're going to doodle is these speech bubbles. Now these ones happen to be generally rectangularly shaped, and if you have trouble getting your shapes to feel straight, practice. Number one is to practice. Sorry about the orientation there. Because of my Zoom, my spatial awareness was off. If you are having a little bit of a hard time keeping your rectangles kind of straight, try moving your arm from the elbow instead of from the wrist until it feels comfortable. And then just practice, practice, practice. Now I've got some rectangles that I'm happy with, and then I'm going to practice making rounded rectangles. And that will give me the general shape that I'm looking for. And then I'm going to practice adding a little speech tag off the bottom of those rectangles. So with all that practice behind me, I'm ready to kind of do my own shapes. Now, if you're worried about doing this, do them in pencil first, and then once you have a shape that you like, trace it over in pen and erase your pencil marks. Totally fantastic tip, and I will use that one later on in this video. Now, to create the doodly depth of these speech bubbles, I am going to start at the corners and draw a line at an angle off to the back of the shape. And then I try to keep those lines about the same length, and then I can trace a second outline between those lines to create the depth of the object. And once you have that depth in place, go ahead and doodle into it. I used just straight lines on the first one. I use a crosshatch on the second one. And then for this third one, I'm going to use those stippling dots. Again, keeping the denser dots closer to the object and letting them fade out. Next up, we're going to do the exact same thing with alphabets, and I'm going to give you tips here on if you're nervous about drawing letters. So the first tip is to give yourself an upper line and a lower line to help keep your letters even and straight. You can see my example off to the left was pretty wonky, and I didn't try to make it wonky, but it came out wonky. So even I, who feel comfortable with a lot of this stuff, can have things go wrong. So I will draw my shape out with pencil first, like I mentioned earlier, and then go ahead and finish up my letter, and then add that shadowing that we talked about on the last item. And don't forget that with some letters, you have this inner section also to do with that shadow. Now, we are going to use these techniques to create word art. I'm just going to do the word hi because that's an easy way to start. I actually will start with just drawing out the letters themselves and then tracing around them, then inking up that tracing line and then erasing all of my pencil marks so that I have more tidy letters. Yes, we are doodling, but we also want it to look artistic and artful without being too sloppy. So having some variation in our doodles is good, but having it totally look sloppy and crooked is not going to make us happy, right? So these are tips to help you get a result that makes you happier. So as you can see here, I am finishing up with my shadowing, and I am just keeping everything to the top of my letters and to the right of my letters so that that creates the depth and shadow in a recognizable and formal manner so that you don't have weird shadows everywhere. I am going to add color to these. I do really like these watercolor pencils from Tim Holtz, but not everybody has them, of course. So you can do this with markers and whatever color medium you appreciate. I just like the variation and flow of color I can get from watercolor, and I'm a watercolor fan in general. So after I add some watercolor to these, you can see some of that color variation. I did cut it out, and you can see it in the upper right-hand corner there, and created my word art. Now, if this still feels too overwhelming for you, go ahead and give yourself the grace to use a pre-existing product. I use some outline letter stamps, and I'm just going to do some stippled shadows to the right-hand side of these letters to simplify the entire process. And giving it some color and cutting it out, I have some much easier word art. So use the method that feels the most comfortable to you. All right, I've crossed that item off of my whole big list of doodles that I wanted to play with today. And next up is going to be these doodle flowers. So I'm going to start with a spot of color. And again, I don't have to do everything from scratch. I can use a circle stamp to start. I use my colored pencils on a wet stamp. But the other thing you can do is on a dry stamp, scribble a marker and then spray it with some water, and that will give you a watercolor effect as well. Okay, once those are dry, I am a little out of order here in my filming because I did have to wait for that to dry. Once those are dry, I'm going to start doodling some flowers, and I just start with a multiple circle center, and then I am creating some petals by going out to the edges of that watercolored spot and then giving it a few squiggles at the end of the petals and then angling it back into the center. And I liked the petals that had more of a triangular shape to them with a squiggle at the wide end of the triangle there. Now I am fussy cutting all of these elements out besides the word art. If you allow your fussy cutting to take some bumps and lumps along the way, that is going to have more of a doodling look to them, including the frames we did earlier. So don't worry about being a perfect fussy cutter. Okay, with that being said, I have moved on to the next item, which is just this zigzag paper. I did make some pencil lines on the paper to start to help me get the flow of these zigzags, and then I only kind of pencil lined half of the paper, and by the time I got to the bottom half of the paper, I felt like I could freehand the zigzags well enough. And then I just erase the pencil lines when I'm done. Easy peasy. Okay, for the next one I popped up, we are going to do a full doodled piece of pattern paper. Now, the example is mostly hearts, but I'm going to show you some other ideas here. I am starting with a pencil line grid. Now, that is a formal shape, and we're going to end up with a random doodle shape, but let me talk you through this process. I am creating a heart doodle wherever those pencil lines intersect, being sure to also run these doodles off the edge of the paper. Then within each grid, I'm going to add more doodling. I'm starting with these flower doodles, which is just an open circle with squiggly petals around the outside. The randomness comes in because I am altering where I am placing these flowers within that grid. And then I'm doing kind of a lightning bolt, and I am sure to kind of angle the direction of the lightning bolt as I go to add to the randomness. Here is just some polka dots. It's just a cluster of 5 polka dots. That's it. And that is its own mark on the paper. I am adding in any spots that I missed with other shapes. Next up is just a triangle, and I'm filling in some of the gaps as we go. Now with this not last shape, but with this next shape, I am doing kind of a faux tulipy kind of shape, but because I'm not comfortable drawing that shape in multiple directions, I will turn my paper in multiple directions in order to get randomness from that shape. And then as the final piece, I am filling in all the gaps with circles with a dot in the middle. And so I am adding about 3 circles with a dot in the middle to each of those grids. And you can see in the end how random it looks, even though we started with a grid. All right, the final thing we're going to work on today is this kind of journaling card art. Now, the journaling card itself is a square. I'm going to doodle a rounded rectangle to start mine, and I'm going to create a little speech bubble. The one on the example was a heart. I'm just going to create the same shape of speech bubbles we've already done as a mask. So I'm going to put some temporary adhesive on the back of that and glue it down into the middle of my rectangle, getting some excess glue off there. And that is going to leave an empty space in that shape once we doodle over it. So I say doodle, but really we're just tipping our markers sideways, which is a doodle technique, and then just drawing straight lines across. So it's not a lot of work to do this style of doodling. So if the other things feel like too much, maybe this one won't. Maybe this one will feel achievable. And then I'm just going to trace around the outer edges of the outer shape and the inner shape so that I get some multiple squiggly doodly lines, and that is more of the doodle element of this one. And then I'm going to write my words in the middle, which says, "You're weird and I like it," which I took directly from the inspiration piece. Now, I do kind of wish I had done my words in pencil first, because the spacing of the words didn't kind of fall where I liked it to be. But it's done and it is fun. So I just wrote my words and then added a little dot at the starts and stops of each of the strokes of the letters. So nothing complicated, but that gives me the doodle look to regular writing. So I'm leaving you here with some close-ups of these projects. And I really hope that I've inspired you to try some doodles of your own. I am not a big artist, but I am artful, and I say this all the time. You can be artful too. Just start small with simple shapes and work your way up. And I hope I showed a good example of doing so with this video. If you have any questions or comments, please do drop me a line and I will do my best to answer them. And until I am back with you next time for more videos, do have an artful day.